Uncle Richard smiled too much. His grin was wide and perfect, but his eyes stayed cold. My mother said he'd always been selfish, finding shortcuts and using people. When I was young, he brought me candy, but I learned his kindness only appeared when he wanted something. Grandfather owned a beautiful house on Maple Street with a garden full of apple trees. He'd made his money building homes, working hard and saving every dollar. Everyone knew he had money stored away. Richard knew it best of all. That's when everything changed. Richard started visiting more, bringing flowers and meals, talking about old memories. It seemed kind at first, but something felt wrong. Grandfather got sick in early spring. The doctors said his heart was weak and he needed rest. Richard showed up the next day looking concerned, offering to help with everything. Grandmother was grateful because she was tired. The family thought Richard was finally becoming responsible. My mother was suspicious though. I started watching him carefully. Richard answered phones before grandmother could reach them. He sorted mail and kept certain letters in his coat. When relatives called, Richard said he had everything handled. One afternoon, I caught him searching through grandfather's study. I started keeping a notebook, writing down dates and times when Richard did strange things. Richard brought a new caregiver named Miss Hayes. She was quiet and nervous. She was kind to grandfather, but I noticed she seemed afraid of Richard. One day, I heard them in the hallway. Richard's voice was low and mean, threatening her job if she didn't follow his instructions exactly. Richard started bringing documents for grandfather to sign. He'd say they were routine papers. Grandfather was tired and trusted Richard, signing whatever was placed before him. My mother tried to look at one paper, but Richard snatched it away. Weeks passed and grandfather grew weaker. Richard became more controlling, telling relatives not to visit and changing locks on the study door. Grandmother's bank account started losing money, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Richard offered to investigate, taking over her checkbook and statements. Instead, more money went missing. That night, I found torn bank statements in the trash. I taped them together. The numbers showed money being transferred to an unknown account. I hid these papers with my notebook. Richard started talking about grandfather's will, saying he'd been discussing it with grandfather. He told different relatives different stories, each designed to make Richard look like the favored son. People started arguing with each other, confused. Richard sat back and watched the chaos he'd created. Miss Hayes finally talked to me when Richard wasn't around. She was crying, saying Richard had threatened her job if she didn't follow his orders. He'd forced her to give grandfather sleeping pills at certain times, so he'd be drowsy when signing papers. I told her to write everything down. She agreed but was frightened. 2 days later, Richard fired Miss Hayes suddenly. A new caregiver named Mrs. Crawford started immediately, completely loyal to Richard. My mother hired a private investigator named Mr. Dixon. Within a week, he discovered Richard had opened bank accounts using forged documents and had been selling small family properties without permission, pocketing the money. Richard started acting more confident, walking around like he already owned everything. He discussed selling the apple trees for a swimming pool. He bought a new car, an expensive watch, and ate at fancy restaurants. One evening, I overheard Richard on the phone, laughing and mocking grandmother's confusion. He called grandfather a foolish old man. I recorded his words. Mr. Dixon discovered that 4 months earlier, grandfather had secretly visited a lawyer named Mr. Harding who specialized in estate planning. The timing was interesting, right before Richard intensified his control. Richard found my notebook. He confronted me in the driveway, his smile gone. He said I was making up stories and threatened me. Then he tore my notebook into pieces. I picked up every scrap and taped them together. He didn't know I had copies on my computer. Grandfather passed away peacefully on a Tuesday evening in autumn. Everyone was sad except Richard, who looked excited. At the funeral, he kept making phone calls outside. The next morning, Richard arrived with a briefcase full of papers, announcing he'd handle all estate matters. He started calling banks and lawyers, speaking as if he already owned everything. Richard tried to access grandfather's bank accounts. The manager said they'd need to verify everything first. Richard became angry and demanded immediate access, but the manager remained calm. Richard left furious. My mother contacted Mr. Harding, the lawyer grandfather had visited. He said he'd be in touch soon about something important. Richard started clearing out grandfather's house, boxing up valuables. When grandmother asked what he was doing, he said he was protecting them. But we knew he was preparing to sell everything. My mother tried to stop him, but Richard had changed the locks. The bank started investigating Richard's documents. They'd found irregularities, signatures that didn't match, dates that seemed wrong. The will reading was scheduled. Richard prepared carefully, expecting to be named primary heir. He'd already picked out a mansion to buy. The family gathered in Mr. Harding's office. Richard sat in front, smiling. Grandmother looked tired. I sat in back with my evidence folder. Mr. Harding explained that grandfather had updated his will 4 months before death. He began reading. Grandfather had left instructions that no single family member should have complete control. A neutral trustee would manage everything. Grandfather had noted concerns about manipulation and dishonesty in the family. Then came the crucial part. Any family member found to have forged documents, stolen money, or threatened others would be removed from the will completely. Everyone looked at Richard, his hands shook. Mr. Harding showed copies of documents Richard had submitted. The signatures didn't match originals. Some dates were impossible. He also had statements from Miss Hayes and Mrs. Crawford, who'd both documented everything Richard made them do. Richard stammered excuses, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, recordings, forged signatures, my notebook entries, everything fit together perfectly. Mr. Harding announced Richard was removed from any inheritance. He'd received nothing. The police had been contacted about the forgeries and theft. Richard jumped up, shouting this was unfair, but everyone could see the truth. He stormed out, tires screeching. Mr. Harding explained how grandfather had suspected Richard's dishonesty months earlier and secretly updated his will to protect the family. Over the next days, more emerged. Richard had gambling debts and had borrowed money from dangerous people. His car was repossessed. His apartment was emptied. His life collapsed rapidly. The police investigated. Richard was questioned multiple times, trying to charm his way out, but detectives weren't fooled. Then Mrs. Coleman, a neighbor, reported witnessing Richard threatening Miss Hayes. Her statement added charges of witness intimidation and assault. The family began healing. Grandmother moved in with my mother, the house was sold and money was divided fairly. My mother started a college fund for me. Richard's trial came months later. The people he'd borrowed from filed lawsuits. His accounts were frozen. He couldn't afford a good lawyer. The family stopped speaking to Richard. His apology calls went unanswered. His lies had been too cruel. At trial I attended with my mother. Richard looked thinner, older. His smile was gone. The prosecution presented everything methodically. The jury deliberated 3 hours and found Richard guilty on all charges: fraud, forgery, theft, and witness intimidation. The judge said she'd seen many criminals, but few so calculated in victimizing their own family. She sentenced him to 5 years in prison, full restitution, and permanent removal from future family estate matters. Richard was led away in handcuffs, shoulders slumped. It was finally over. I learned important lessons. Charm without honesty is just manipulation. Greed destroys everything. Truth always surfaces eventually. Years passed. Richard was released and lives alone in another city, working quiet jobs. He's become a cautionary tale. Grandmother passed away peacefully, surrounded by family who truly cared. The house is now owned by a young couple with children. Sometimes I see kids playing under the apple trees. Grandfather would have liked that. His legacy wasn't money or property. It was the lesson that integrity matters more than inheritance, and character is the only thing worth passing down. The weeks following the trial brought unexpected peace to our family. Relatives who'd been arguing because of Richard's lies began talking again, realizing how he'd manipulated everyone. Family dinners resumed, filled with honest conversation instead of suspicion. My mother often spoke about grandfather's wisdom. He'd seen through Richard's schemes early and acted decisively to protect everyone. His secret visit to Mr. Harding had been the turning point, though none of us knew it at the time. I kept my notebooks as a reminder that paying attention matters. Small observations, carefully documented, had helped bring truth to light. Mr. Dixon told me I'd make a good detective someday. Richard's name became something we rarely mentioned. When we did, it was with sadness rather than anger. Grandmother had loved him despite everything, hoping he'd change. That hope died slowly, painfully. The money from the estate helped everyone in practical ways. My aunt started a small business. My uncle paid off his mortgage. My mother's college fund for me grew substantially. These weren't just financial gifts, they were grandfather's way of caring for his family even after death. The mansion Richard had dreamed of buying was purchased by someone else, a family who actually earned their wealth through honest work. Sometimes irony delivers its own justice. Mrs. Crawford, the second caregiver, visited my mother once to apologize. She'd been desperate for work and ignored her conscience when Richard made his demands. She cried as she explained how guilt had consumed her after grandfather died. My mother forgave her, understanding that Richard had manipulated everyone differently. Miss Hayes found work with another family and wrote us a letter thanking us for believing her. She said standing up to Richard, even though it cost her job initially, had given her strength to face other challenges in life. Sometimes doing the right thing hurts at first but heals us later. I visited grandfather's grave regularly, telling him about school and life. I'd thank him for protecting us, for being smart enough to see danger and brave enough to act. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates, but it represented so much more: integrity, wisdom, love. My mother planted apple tree saplings in our backyard, seeds from grandfather's old garden. She said we'd grow our own orchard, a living reminder of where we came from and what mattered. The trees grew slowly but steadily, just like healing. Richard's story spread through our community as a warning. People recognized that charm could mask cruelty, that family relationships required trust earned through actions, not just words. Years later, I learned Richard had tried contacting grandmother before she died, asking for forgiveness. She'd been too ill to respond, but my mother wasn't sure grandmother would have answered anyway. Some wounds cut too deep. The house on Maple Street became a happy place again under new ownership. The family there had no idea about its complicated history, and that seemed right. Houses shouldn't carry the weight of past mistakes forever. They should shelter new dreams and better stories. I graduated high school with honors, using money from grandfather's estate for college. I studied law, wanting to help families protect themselves from people like Richard. My mother cried at graduation, saying grandfather would have been proud. On quiet evenings, I'd pull out my old notebooks and read through them. The careful documentation of dates, times, and observations reminded me that truth matters and patience pays off. Justice isn't always immediate, but it's worth pursuing. My mother framed a photo of grandfather in our living room. In it, he's standing in his garden, surrounded by apple blossoms, smiling genuinely, so different from Richard's calculated grin. That photo reminded us what real happiness looked like: contentment from honest work and love freely given. Richard remained in his distant city, a shadow of who he'd pretended to be. His story ended not with drama but with quiet isolation, perhaps the truest consequence of betraying those who'd loved him. The family reunions became meaningful again. Without Richard's manipulation creating divisions, we rediscovered genuine connections. Cousins I barely knew became friends. Aunts and uncles shared stories without hidden agendas. These gatherings honored grandfather's memory better than any monument could. Mr. Dixon, the investigator, occasionally checked in with my mother. He'd moved on to other cases but said ours had reminded him why his work mattered. Exposing fraud wasn't just about money. It was about protecting families from predators, even when those predators were family members themselves. The legal system, despite its slowness, had worked. Evidence mattered, truth mattered, justice, though delayed, had arrived. I sometimes wondered if Richard ever reflected on his choices. If prison had changed him or merely made him more careful about hiding his true nature. My mother said some people never change, they just get better at pretending. Perhaps Richard was one of those people. But his story had changed us. We'd learned to watch for warning signs, to question motives, to protect the vulnerable. Grandfather's final gift wasn't just money, it was the lesson that preparation and awareness could prevent betrayal. The apple trees in our backyard grew taller each year, their branches reaching toward sky, their roots digging deep into soil. Like family, they needed strong foundations and room to grow. When I started college, I wrote an essay about integrity for my ethics class. I told Richard's story without using names, explaining how one man's greed had nearly destroyed a family, but ultimately revealed what truly mattered. My professor gave me an A, and said the essay demonstrated real understanding of moral courage. My mother kept grandfather's old desk in our home office. Sometimes I'd sit there doing homework, feeling connected to his wisdom and strength. The desk had witnessed his plans to protect us, had held the documents he'd signed with Mr. Harding. It was more than furniture, it was a legacy. Richard's empty chair at family gatherings spoke volumes. No one mentioned him, but everyone remembered. The younger cousins grew up hearing stories about grandfather's kindness and business success, but rarely about Richard's betrayal. My mother said children should learn from positive examples first. They'd discover life's harsh lessons soon enough. For now, let them know that goodness existed and prevailed. I visited the law offices where Mr. Harding worked, thanking him for helping grandfather protect our family. He smiled and said grandfather had been remarkably clear-headed during their meetings, knowing exactly what needed to be done. Some people faced mortality with wisdom rather than fear. The mansion Richard had coveted was eventually sold again, changing hands like any other property. Dreams built on stolen foundations never lasted. Looking back, I understood that Richard's downfall wasn't dramatic or violent, it was systematic and complete. Every lie he told, every document he'd forged, every person he'd threatened had been carefully documented by reality itself. Karma hadn't needed to act aggressively, it had simply waited with infinite patience. The cruelest people often believe they're untouchable, insulated by charm and manipulation. But when every selfish act is recorded by those paying attention, when truth is preserved despite attempts to destroy it, justice becomes inevitable. I learned that week, that month, that year, integrity isn't about grand gestures but consistent choices. Grandfather had lived honestly, loved genuinely, and planned wisely. Richard had schemed, stolen, and betrayed. Their endings reflected their choices. Character, not inheritance, defines a person's true worth. That was grandfather's final lesson, and it echoed through every generation that followed. The apple trees grew strong, the family stayed connected, and Richard's name faded into cautionary history, a reminder that karma doesn't need to act violently when truth patiently waits to deliver justice.